Welcome to Forgotten Fronts, Warfare Across the Ages. I'm your host, and here we explore the battles, leaders, and strategies that shaped our world. From ancient empires to modern conflict, we break down how warfare forged power, how warfare redrew borders, and how warfare changed history. Welcome to the front lines. Before chlorine gas rolled across the battlefield, before men drowned in air, World War I had already rewritten the rules of combat. Europe did not enter 1914 expecting stagnation. Military planners believed in movement, offensive spirit, rapid mobilization. Rail timetables were measured to the minute. Confidence was simply not subtle. It was institutional. Instead, by 1914, the Western Front hardened into something almost geological. From the North Sea to Switzerland, opposing armies dug into the earth. Trenches were not temporary foxholes. They became infrastructure. There was a layered system, a frontline trench, a support trench, a reserve trench, and a communication trench that connected them all. Barbed wire sprawled across no man's land in chaotic webs. Machine guns were positioned to interlock fields of fire. Artillery zeroed in coordinates that were fired on repeatedly. The land itself changed. Trees shredded into splinters. Villages were reduced to foundations. Fields were turned into mud. Soldiers were living in conditions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Boots were rarely dry. Uniforms were stiff with dirt. Rats were feeding on bodies that could not be retrieved. Shell shock emerging before it even had a name. And the aftermath was brutal. Thousands were killed for yards of gain. Offenses were launched with whistles and optimism that ended in blood and stillness. The war had become a machine, and machines demand innovation. Commanders began asking a question that echoes throughout military history. How do we break the stalemate? Artillery was already maximized. Infantry assaults were catastrophic already. Technology had outrun tactics. So, something had to change. And that change came not from steel. That change came from chemistry. Chlorine gas was not unknown in 1915. It was widely used in industry. It was widely used in manufacturing. It was widely used in water treatment. And it was widely used for bleaching. It was a chemical that modern society already handled. That is what makes its weaponization so unsettling. The same compound used in civilian life was redirected towards suffocation. From a military perspective, chlorine did have its advantages. Chlorine was heavier than air. Chlorine would sink into trenches. Chlorine was relatively easy to produce in volume. And perhaps the most important aspect of it, there was no existing defense against chlorine. The German High Command did not initially view chlorine as a horror. They viewed it as a force multiplier. If gas could clear trenches without sacrificing thousands of infantry, then it was, to their calculation, efficient. This is going to be an important distinction. The decision was not framed internally as cruelty. It was framed as problem solving. When your distance is from consequence, making such calculations becomes easier. They needed maps, they needed wind charts, they needed their cylinder placements, and they needed release timing. All of these were discussed in planning rooms far, far from the trench line. But when those valves opened, the consequences would not remain abstract. April 22nd, 1915. The Second Battle of Ypres. The line had been tense for days. French colonial troops and Canadian divisions held portions of the front. German forces had quietly positioned over 5,000 steel cylinders along a 4-mile stretch of trench. Each was filled with chlorine. Not shells, not artillery rounds, but cylinders filled with chlorine. They waited. They waited not for courage, but they waited for the wind. Because chlorine as a weapon did not obey command. Chlorine as a weapon obeyed the atmosphere. In the late afternoon, the wind shifts. German soldiers open the valves. There is no explosion. There is no flash. There is no immediate thunder. Just a low, creeping release. At first, that cloud hugs the German line, but then it begins to move. It moves slowly. It moves deliberately. And it moves across no man's land. From the Allied trenches, soldiers noticed a strange haze. It was greenish-yellow, and it was low to the ground. Some assume it was smoke from the artilleries. Others think it might be a natural mist. No one understands. And that misunderstanding is critical. Panic becomes delayed, and delayed panic can be deadlier. The cloud advances. It rolls over barbed wire. It slips into shell craters, and it sinks. Chlorine is heavier than air. Then the first cough. A sharp, involuntary reaction. A soldier rubs his eyes. Another clears his throat. Then more coughing, and more. The smell reaches them next. A sharp, metallic bitterness. Chlorine irritates immediately. It does not wait. A soldier inhales deeply, instinctively trying to clear the sensation. The deeper breath draws more gas into the lungs. And that is when the real damage begins. Chlorine reacts with the moisture in the respiratory tract to form hydrochloric acid. The lining of the lungs begin to burn. The airways swell, and fluid begins to accumulate. The human body responds with panic because breathing is not optional. The soldier tries to shout an order. His voice cracks. He coughs violently, and he tries to inhale again. But the burning intensifies. Eyes stream uncontrollably, and men are clawing at collars. Some attempt to climb out of the trench, because someone had shouted that the gas sinks. And it does, because chlorine is heavier than air. Chlorine pools in the lowest ground, in trench bottoms, in dugouts, in depressions. It turns defensive infrastructure into traps. One soldier falls to his knees, another stumbles blindly forward. Some begin running, not away from the enemy, but away from the air. How do you run away from air? There is no drilled response. There are no issued gas masks, and there is no standard procedure. Some men urinate on cloth and press it to their faces because ammonia in urine can partially neutralize chlorine. But what happens in chaos? Very few think clearly. The coughing becomes violent. It becomes uncontrolled. The men gag, and some vomit, and some collapse. Those who attempt to inhale deeply often make the damage worse. Their bodies are betraying them. There is something truly uniquely terrifying about losing control of breath. The gunfire becomes secondary. Artillery becomes distant. The immediate war is happening inside your chest. The immediate war is happening with your own body. German troops watch from across this field. At first, the cloud appears to be successful. Sections of the trench have fallen silent, and movement becomes erratic. There are gaps that begin to appear, but the Germans had not fully anticipated something else, that the wind is variable. And releasing chlorine is not like firing artillery. Chlorine lingers, and chlorine moves unpredictably. Some German soldiers pull cloth over their own faces, wary of sudden shifts, because gas does not recognize uniform color. It simply obeys physics. In the Allied trench, survivors attempt to regroup. Some are staggering backwards. Some hold their positions despite their burning lungs. The line partially collapses. The gaps start to form. The German infantry move forward to exploit the breach. But even here, the advance is cautious. Because the cloud still lingers. Because that cloud still burns. And because that cloud still moves. By nightfall, thousands are dead or incapacitated, but something else has happened. The psychological boundary has been shattered. Artillery was violent, and machine guns were devastating, but both were visible threats. Chlorine was invisible until it was not. How do you fight something that is invisible? Chlorine weaponized the atmosphere. Chlorine transformed the neutral act of breathing into a calculated risk. And once that concept exists, it cannot be undone. By the next day, medical stations are overwhelmed. Doctors struggle to treat injuries they have never seen before. There are men coughing pink foam. There are lungs filling with fluid. There is delayed deaths hours after the exposure. Because chlorine does not always kill immediately. Chlorine destroys gradually. And gradual suffocation leaves memory. The shock has rippled outward. Reports are spreading quickly that gas had entered the war, and it would not leave quietly. We are going to move over to Eastern Europe in 1915. The war here does not at all look like the Western Front. It is wider, and it is less industrialized, and it is more fluid. But somehow, it is no less brutal. Here, the rail lines are lifelines. Fortresses matter, and Osowiec sits exactly where it needs to. Oswiec was constructed in the late 19th century by the Russian Empire. Oswiec was not ornamental. Oswiec was functional. It guarded a key railway corridor running through the marshland terrain. The ground around it was difficult. The ground around it was wet, and the ground around it was soft. The ground was unforgiving to mass troop movement, and that terrain made the fortress valuable. Because honestly, if you cannot move around it easily, then you simply must confront it. For months, German artillery attempted to do just that. Shells pounded into the outer defenses, and concrete cracked, but it did not collapse. Earthen ramparts absorbed that impact. Osowiec Fortress did what it was designed to do. It delayed. And delay buys mobilization. Delay buys time for reinforcements. Delay frustrates momentum. By mid-1915, German command faced a familiar problem. Osowiec had still not fallen. It had endured bombardment, and its defenders still remained. So, the logic applied at Ypres was applied here. If walls cannot be shattered, perhaps the lungs can. August 6th, 1915. That bombardment begins again. There is heavy shelling. It is measured and it is sustained. The defenders inside Osowiec Fortress brace. They are accustomed to the artillery. They know its rhythm. They know how to survive impact. But then the shelling shifts and the cloud appears. It is Chlorine once again. But this time, the geography changes everything. You see, at Ypres, trenches were open to the sky. At Osowiec, corridors, casemates, and enclosed gun positions trapped the air. Stone does not stop gas. Stone contains it. The chlorine is rolling toward the fortress, and it sinks into depressions, and it seeps through embrasures. It filters down stairwells. The defenders smell it before they see it clearly. It is sharp, it is chemical, and it is wrong. The coughing begins. In enclosed space, the coughing echoes. The coughing is amplified. Men are scrambling for makeshift protection. There is cloth soaked in water, rags pressed tightly over their mouths and their noses. But chlorine does not politely stop at fabric. It seeps and it burns. As soldiers inhale, their throats tighten instantly. They try to suppress the coughing, but they cannot. Their chests spasm, and they brace against walls. Other men stumble past him, already spitting blood. The gas has settled lower. Some men have attempted to climb higher into higher firing positions. Some collapse before reaching them. Their eyes are streaming. Their skin at the neck is reddened and blistered because it has been exposed to this gas warfare. Breathing becomes conscious. Breathing becomes deliberate. And breathing has become painful. There is something psychologically different about gas in confined space. In a trench, there is at least a horizon. At Oswiec, there is stone. Stone walls, stone ceilings, stone corridors filling with poison. The men do not just fear the gas, they feel that they are trapped with it. The German command expects the same outcome seen elsewhere: release, wait, advance, and secure. They anticipate silence because chlorine had already proven devastating. Outside the fortress, German infantry prepare to move forward once the cloud does its work. Inside the fortress, the damage is severe. Reports later describe leaves on nearby trees turning black from chemical exposure. This concentration is high. This is not a minor release. It is meant to break resistance entirely. Many of those defenders die quickly. Some suffocate, some collapse from lung damage. Some survive the first wave, but are severely burned internally. And yet, by some grace, movement begins. The movement is slow and the movement is deliberate. Men who should not be standing push themselves upright. Their uniforms are darkened, their faces are swollen, cloth is wrapped around their mouths and noses, their eyes are red, their breathing is ragged. Some are leaning on rifles to steady themselves. They know the assault is coming. They know surrender is expected, and something inside of them refuses it. Outside, German infantry begin advancing towards the fortress. Boots sink into damp earth. The air still carries faint chlorine sting. They expect broken resistance. They expect empty firing positions. They expect collapse. However, through thinning chemical haze, they see figures, at first distinct, then clearer, moving towards them, not running, not retreating, but advancing. The German soldiers hesitate. The expectation fractures instantly. Gas was supposed to eliminate this resistance. Instead, resistance is walking towards them as if they are zombies. These Russian defenders are not charging with pristine uniforms and perfect formation. These Russian defenders are damaged. These Russian defenders are coughing violently as they advance. There is blood staining cloth. They are breathing unevenly, and yet they have their bayonets fixed, and they move forward, step by step by step. It's not fast and it's not theatrical, but it is relentless. There is something utterly destabilizing about an enemy who should not be standing. The confidence is weakening, the cohesion trembles, a shout rings out. Some German soldiers instinctively fall back, not from superior numbers. The Russian defenders were overwhelmed. And not from the overwhelming force, but from the shock. The clash that follows is not grand. It is brief, it is close, and it is confused. There are shots fired at short distance, bayonets meeting resistance, and shouting through damaged lungs. The Russians do not need speed. The Russians need proximity. And proximity under those conditions becomes terrifying. The German line falters, the German line retreats, and the assault has collapsed. Not because the fortress was untouched, but because expectation met defiance, and defiance did not yield. This moment had earned its name, the attack of the dead men. Not because they were undead, but because they looked as if death had already claimed them. And still, they advanced. Afterward, the field is quiet. There is no triumph. The gas lingers faintly in the air. Some of the defenders who advanced will die later from lung damage. Some will live with permanent respiratory injury. Oswiec will eventually be abandoned during broader Russian withdrawal. But on that day, at the Battle of the Dead Men, it was not conquered. That fortress held the line. Endurance under those conditions becomes something larger than tactic. It becomes a memory. News of chlorine at Ypres did not remain at the front. That news traveled quickly. There were reports from soldiers, medical dispatches, and newspaper correspondence. Descriptions were inconsistent at first. Men choking, eyes burned blind, lungs filling with fluid, clouds that killed without bullets. At first, there was disbelief. Surely this had to be an exaggeration. Surely this was battlefield confusion. But then came the confirmation. Chlorine had been used intentionally, and once confirmed, outrage followed. Public condemnation was immediate. Newspapers printed descriptions of suffocating soldiers. Medical officers described delayed deaths. Men who appeared stable then deteriorated hours later as fluid accumulated in their damaged lungs. There is something especially disturbing about a weapon that does not always kill instantly. It lingers, it deteriorates, and it leaves time for awareness. Governments had issued statements condemning the use of chemical weapons, but beneath condemnation, the calculation had already begun. If Germany had crossed this line, could Britain and France afford not to respond? This is where we encounter one of the most uncomfortable truths in military history. The weapon that shocks the world rarely disappears. It multiplies. It multiplies. Within months, Britain expanded its own gas program. France had followed. New compounds were researched. Phosgene, mustard gas, each more deadly, each more persistent. That boundary that was crossed at Ypres was not reversed. It had become normalized. Gas masks were developed quickly. They were crude at first, soaked cloths, then more advanced respirators came. Training manuals began including chemical response drills. Meteorology became strategic. Wind speed was studied, wind direction was studied, atmospheric stability was studied. Air was no longer a neutral terrain. It was a variable. Could you imagine having to be terrified of air? Soldiers began carrying masks at all times. False alarms triggered chaos. Letters home described fear of gas more than fear of bullets. Bullets are immediate and gas is uncertain. It might drift, it might linger, and it might come in the night. There's something uniquely intimate about suffocation. Suffocation bypasses courage. Suffocation bypasses discipline. And suffocation reduces warfare to breath. And breath is universal. The medical community scrambled to understand chemical injury. Chlorine destroyed lung tissue. Phosgene caused delayed pulmonary edema. And mustard gas blistered skin and eyes, lingering in soil for days. Entire hospital wards became filled with men who had survived the battlefield, only to struggle for air days later. Some had recovered partially, and some never did. The psychological impact of this lingered as well. Gas masks had become the symbols of modern war. Photographs of soldiers wearing respirators looked inhuman. They looked alien. They looked haunted. The image itself changed public perception of warfare. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol attempted to prohibit the use of chemical weapons. It banned its deployment, but it did not eliminate the stockpiles, and it did not erase the research. The nations signed, and the nations also quietly prepared. Because once imagination changes, preparation has to follow. The shadow of Ypres stretched beyond World War I. Chemical stockpiles remained through the 20th century. World War II saw limited battlefield chemical use in Europe, largely due to the fear of retaliation. But that knowledge still remained. That possibility still remained. And that possibility is part of this legacy. Now return to Oswiec. Return to the image of damaged men advancing through gas. The moment did not stop chemical warfare, but it created a counter-narrative. Gas was terrifying, but it was not absolute. Gas could injure, and gas could kill, and gas could destabilize, but it could not guarantee surrender. And that matters, because warfare often hinges on expectations. Expectations of collapse, expectations of fear, and expectation of inevitability. At Osowiec, inevitability had fractured, and that fracture became the legend it is known as today. Chemical warfare did not win World War I. It did not end the stalemate, but it altered the imagination, and imagination shapes doctrine. Once air became weaponized, every soldier entering the future wars carried that knowledge. The sky was no longer neutral, the wind was no longer harmless, and breath itself had become strategic. And that is the true turning point. When historians talk about turning points, they often point to battles that shifted the borders: Cannae, Waterloo, and Normandy. But sometimes the true turning point is not in the territory. It is perception. Before 1915, soldiers feared bullets. They feared artillery. They feared visible violence. After Ypres, they feared the air. That is a fundamental shift. Artillery can be heard and infantry can be seen, but gas drifts, and it settles, and it waits. And that waiting changes behavior. After chlorine rolled across trenches, soldiers slept with masks within arm's reach. They watched wind direction with fear, and they listened for alarms. Even when no gas was present, its possibility altered the posture. It altered the rest, and it altered the trust. Air, once neutral, had become conditional. And once a battlefield expands into something invisible, something atmospheric, it becomes harder to feel safe anywhere. Now return one more time to Osowiec. Picture those defenders again, not as legends and not as propaganda, but as men. Men with burned lungs, men with blistered skin, and men with vision blurred. They were standing because retreat felt worse, advancing not because they were fearless, but because surrender meant certainty, and certainty in that moment meant collapse. There is something profoundly human in that choice. It's not invincible, it's not mythical, it is simply just human. And human resilience under chemical assault carries weight. The attack of the dead men did not reverse chemical warfare, and it did not end its use, but it reminded both sides of something important. Even when warfare becomes impersonal, even when it becomes scientific, and even when it weaponizes the atmosphere, it is still fought by bodies, it is still fought by lungs, and it is still fought by breath. Chemical warfare did not disappear after World War I. The Geneva Protocol attempted prohibition, but stockpiles remained. The research continued. The 20th century would carry chemical weapons as a shadow, often unused on European battlefields due to the fear of retaliation. But it was never forgotten, it was never fully abandoned, and that possibility lingered. And that lingering possibility is the true inheritance of 1915. Once imagination changes, doctrine follows. Once doctrine shifts, preparation follows. And preparation keeps memory alive. There is a reason images of soldiers in gas masks remain haunting. They look less human. Their eyes are hidden behind glass, and faces are obscured. Identity reduced to filtration. It represents something deeper than injury. It represents distance between man and environment, between breath and safety, between survival and vulnerability. And that distance began in earnest at Ypres. So what do we take from this? Not that chemical warfare was the deadliest innovation of World War I, because it wasn't. Artillery killed more, and machine guns slaughtered more, but chlorine altered something psychological. It proved that war would not remain confined to steel and gunpowder. It could expand into chemistry, into biology, and into the atmosphere. And once that expansion occurs, there is no returning to innocence. Osowiec reminds us of resilience, and Ypres reminds us of escalation. Together, they represent a moment when warfare crossed into a new dimension. A dimension where survival depended not only on courage, but on what you inhaled. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. War had always threatened life, but in 1915, it threatened the act that sustains life. Breath. And once breath becomes battlefield, war becomes something else entirely. You have been listening to Forgotten Fronts, Warfare Across the Ages. History is shaped by decisions, discipline, and decisive moments. Join me next time as we step back into the conflicts that changed the world. Until then, I will see you on the front lines.